Mastering Python part 3 of this 100 solved exercises to accelerate the learning. So in this part 3, we will deal with the repeat loops. Now the repeat loops are while loop or the for loop. So while loop is like which repeatedly executes a block of code as long as a specified condition is true. The syntax for this is like this: the condition is true, then you will continue to print that statement. And next is the for loop. So even in the for loop, iterates over a sequence such as a list, tuple or string or any iterable object. It executes a block of code for each item in the sequence. And the syntax for this is like this: for I in range 5, print I. So here we will start with the first program that shall show how to display the number 1 through 10 using a loop. So here the first approach is using a while loop. So we'll start by initializing a variable num with the value of 1. So this variable will keep track of the current number being printed. So we use a while loop to iterate as long as this condition num less than equals to 10 is true. So this condition ensures that the loop will execute until the number reaches 11. Inside this loop, we print the value of num using this print function. And after printing the number, we increment the value of num by 1 using this function num plus equals to 1 statement. This ensures that the loop progresses to the next number and the loop continues executing until the value reaches 11, at which point the condition becomes false and the loop terminates. The next approach is using a for loop. So here we are using a for loop to iterate through the number 1 to 10. The range function is used to generate a sequence of numbers from 1 to 10 inclusive. And the range function is called with two arguments: start value 1 in this case and value is 11 in this case exclusive. Inside the loop, the variable num takes on each value in the range from 1 to 10 in each iteration, and this print function is used to display the value of num on the console. And the loop continues for each number in the range, displaying the numbers 1 through 10. The next program is to display all the numbers from 1 to 100. So here we are using a for loop to iterate through the numbers 1 to 100. The range function is used to generate a sequence of numbers from 1 to 100 inclusive, and the range function is called with two arguments: the start value 1 in this case, the AND value 101 in this case exclusive. And inside the loop, the variable num takes on each value in the range from 1 to 100 in each iteration. And this print function is used to display the value of num on the console. And the loop continues for each number in the range, displaying the numbers from 1 to 100. So once the loop finishes iterating through all the numbers, the program ends. The next program is to print all the even numbers from 1 to 100. The first solution in this is using a variable num with the value of 1. So this variable will keep track of the current number being checked. So we use a while loop to iterate as long as this condition num less than equals to 100 is true, which ensures that loop will execute until the number reaches 100. And inside the loop, we use if statement to check if that number is even. We can do this by checking if the remainder of dividing num by 0 is even. So here we are checking if this number is 0 or not. Right? So if this condition is true, we use the print function to display the value of num on the console. After checking and possibly printing the number, we increment the value of num by 1 by using the statement num plus equals to 1 statement, which ensures that loop progresses to the next step. And the loop continues executing until the value of num reaches 100, at which the point the condition num less than equals to 100 becomes false and the loop terminates. The second solution in this is using a variable num with a value of 2. And this variable will keep track of the current even number being printed. Here we are using a while loop as long as this condition num less than equals to 100 is true, which ensures that loop will execute until the number reaches 100. And inside the loop, we use a print statement to display the value of num on the console. So after printing the number, we increment the num value by 2 using this num plus equals to 2 statement, which ensures that loop progresses to the next even number by skipping odd numbers. And the loop continues executing until the value of num reaches 100, at which this condition num less than equals to 100 becomes false and the loop terminates. And by increment num by 0 in each iteration, we are directly skipping the odd numbers and printing only the even numbers from 1 to 100. And the third approach in this is using a for loop. So we use a for loop to iterate through the even numbers from 2 to 100, and here the range function is used with 3 arguments. The start value 2 in this case, the AND value 101 in this case exclusive, and the step value 2 in this case. So inside this loop the variable num takes on each even number in the range 2 to 100 in each iteration, and the print function is used to display the value of num on the console, and the loop continues for each even number in the range, printing the even numbers from 2 to 100. So once the loop finishes iterating through all the even numbers, the program ends. The next program in this is to display even numbers 1 to 50 and odd numbers 51 to 100 using a repeating loops. So here we start by initializing a num with the value of 1, and this variable will keep track of the current number being checked. So we use a while loop to iterate as long as this condition num less than equals to 50, num less than equals to 100 is true, which ensures that loop will execute until the number reaches 100. And inside the loop we have a nested if statement to check the value of num. So for the first if statement checks if the num is less than equals to 50. If it is, we proceed with the inner if statement. The inner if statement checks if the number is even by using an expression that num divided by 2 is equals to 0. So if this condition is true, meaning num is even and less than equals to 50, we print the message even followed by the value of num. So if the value of num is greater than 50, we proceed to the else block, and this else block is executed when the number is greater than 50. So here we check if the number is odd or not, and this way, after checking and possibly printing the message, we increment the value of num by 1 statement, which ensures that the loop progresses to the next number. Next program is to prompt the user for a number and display the table of that number using a loop. So here we'll have two approaches. In the first approach, we'll start by prompting the user to enter a number using this input function. The int function is used to convert the user input from a string to integer, and this entered number is then stored in a number variable. We use a for loop to iterate through the range 1 through 11, which includes the numbers from 1 to 10, as the upper limit 11 is exclusive. So inside the loop we calculate the product of the number and the current iteration value I and store it to the product variable. We use print statement to display the multiplication table entry in the format number into I is equals to product. And the loop continues for each iteration, displaying the multiplication table entry for each loop. The next solution is using while. So here we will start by prompting the user to enter a number using this input function, and this int function is used to convert the user input from a string to integer, and this entered number is then stored in a number variable. So we'll use a while loop with the condition I less than equals to 10 to iterate until the counter reaches 11, which ensures that loop will execute 10 times correspondingly in the range of 1 to 10. And inside this loop, we calculate the product of the number and the current iteration value and store it in a product variable. We use the print function to display the multiplication entry value in the format number into I is equals to product. So after printing the entry, we increment the value of counter I by 1 by using a statement I plus equals to 1 statement, which ensures that loop progresses to the next iteration, and the loop continues executing until the counter reaches 11, at which the condition I less than equals to 10 becomes false and the loop terminates. The next program which will prompt the user for a number and display the table of that number using a loop. So here we will use a nested for loop through the range 1 through 11 for both multiplicants I and j, and this range includes number from 1 to 10 as the upper limit 11 is exclusive. So inside this nested loop, we calculate the product of two numbers I and j and store it in the product variable. We use the print function to display the multiplication table entry in the format I into j is equals to product. And after printing each entry, this inner loop continues iterating until all the values of j from 1 to 10 has been processed. And once this inner loop finishes iterating for that particular I value, we print a separator line to visually separate each multiplication table. And this outer loop continues iterating for each value of I, repeating the inner loop process and printing the corresponding multiplication table. And once the outer loop finishes iterating all the values from 1 to 10, the program ends. The next program is to ask the user for a number n and display the sum of all numbers from 1 to n. So here we'll start by prompting the user to enter a number using a input function. Int function is used to convert the user input from string to integer, and this entered value is stored in a variable caps N. We initialize the variable sum of numbers to hold the sum of all numbers from 1 to n and will set its initial value to 0. We'll use a for loop with a range function to iterate from 1 to n inclusive, and this range function generates a sequence of numbers starting from 1 up to caps of n. Inside the loop, for each iteration, the current num is added to sum of numbers using this plus equals to operator, and which accumulates the sum of all the numbers. So once the loop finishes iterating over all the numbers from 1 to n, we have a total sum stored in the sum of numbers variable. And by using a for loop and the range function, we iterate through the numbers from 1 to n, accumulating their sum. And finally, the program will display the final sum on the console. The second approach is using a while loop. So here we'll initialize by giving the variable sum of numbers and num. So the sum of variables holds the sum of all numbers and num starts with the value 1 here. We'll use a while loop with the condition num less than equals to caps of n, and this loop will continue until the value of num exceeds caps of n. So inside the loop we add the current value num to the sum of numbers using plus equals to operator, just like in previous solution. After adding the num to the sum, we increment number by 1 by using num plus equals to 1, which ensures that loop progresses to the next number, and the loop continues until the number reaches caps of n and then it terminates. And so finally we'll show the results by using a print function. The next program is to calculate and display the sum of even numbers using a repeating loops. So here we will initialize the variable sum of evens and num. Sum of evens will hold the sum of even numbers. Num value starts with a value of 2, which is the first even number. We'll use a while loop with the condition num less than equals to 100, and this loop will continue until the value of sum exceeds 100. So inside this loop, we add the current num to the sum of evens, and which ensures that we get the next even number in each iteration, and the loop continues until the num reaches 100 and then it terminates. And finally, we use a print function to display the message. Sum of even numbers from 1 to 100 is sum of evens, where sum of evens is the calculated sum. And by using a while loop and incrementing the number by 2 in each iteration, we iterate through even numbers from 2 to 100 and accumulate their sum. Next approach is using for loop. So here we will initialize the variable sum of evens to hold the sum of even numbers and use a for loop with the range function and specify the starting point as 2, ending point as 101 exclusive, and step as 2, which ensures that the loop iterates through even numbers from 2 to 100. And inside the loop, the num variable takes the values of each even number in each iteration, and the loop continues until it iterates through all the even numbers from 2 to 100. And finally, we print the message to display this message here. Next program is to calculate and display the value of power of a number entered by the user. So here first we will prompt the user to enter the base number and the exponent, and then we will initialize the result variable to hold that calculated sum. We'll use a for loop to iterate from 1 to that exponent, and finally we will display the results like this. The next program is to ask the user for a number n and say whether it's a prime number or not. So here we will use the input function to prompt the user to enter a number, and this int function is used to convert this input values to integer. So we initialize the variable is prime to false if the number is less than 2, as the number less than 2 are not prime. So if the number is greater than equals to 2 we set is prime to true initially, and we use a for loop with the range function to iterate from 2 to the square root of the number inclusive. And this loop will check if the number is divisible by any integer in that range. So inside that loop, we use a modulo operator to check if the number is divisible by the current value of I. So if it is divisible, then we set is prime to false and break out of the loop. After the loop, we have determined whether that number is prime or not based on the value of its prime. Finally, we use the print function to display the appropriate message based on the value of is prime. The next program is to prompt the user for a number n and display all prime numbers less than n. So here we use the input function to prompt the user to enter a number. This int function is used to convert this input variable to integer. We'll use a for loop to iterate through numbers from 2 to n exclusive, as 1 is not a prime number. And inside this loop, we initialize the variable is prime to true for each number, and we use a nested for loop to check if that current number is divisible by any integer from 2 to the square root of that number. And inside this nested loop, we use a modulo operator to check if that number is divisible by current value of I. If it is divisible, we set is prime to false and break out of the loop. And after that nested loop, if is prime is true, it means the current number is prime. We use that print function to display the prime number separated by the space. And we use the and equals to braces parameter to ensure that numbers are printed on the same line. And this outer loop continues iterating through the remaining number. So after the loop, we use the print function without any arguments to add a new line which improves the output formatting. The next program is to display the first n prime numbers where n is informed by the user using a loop. So here we use the input function to prompt the user to enter a value for n, and the int function is used to convert the input values to an integer. We initialize a variable count to keep track of the number of prime numbers found, and we initialize the variable sum to 2 as the first prime number is 2, and we'll use a while loop to continue finding prime numbers until we have found n prime numbers. And inside this loop, we initialize a variable is prime to true for each value. We use a for loop to check if the current number is divisible by an integer from 2 to the square root of that number inclusive. We use a for loop to check if the current number is divisible by an integer from 2 to the square root of the number inclusive. Why we are doing so? Because inside this nested loop, we are using a modulo operator to check if the number is divisible by current value of I. If it shall be divisible, we shall set is prime to false and break out of the loop. And after this nested loop, if is prime is still true, it means the current number is prime, and then we will use the print function to display the prime number separated by the space. We use this and equals to braces parameter to ensure the numbers are printed on the same line. We increment the counter by 1 to keep track of the number of prime numbers found, and we increment num by 1 to move to the next number for checking. And this loop continues until the count reaches caps of n, that is we found n prime numbers. And after the loop, we use the print function without any arguments to add a new line which improves the output formatting. The next program is to display the first n perfect squares where n is informed by the user using a loop. So here we use the input function to prompt the user to enter a value of n, and the int function is used to convert this input value to an integer. Here we are initializing a variable count to keep track of this number of perfect squares found. We start with the 0. We initialize a variable num to 1 as we want to start with the first positive integer. And we use a while loop to continue finding perfect squares until we have found n perfect squares. Now inside this loop, we calculate the square of the current number using this operator. We'll use a print function to display the perfect squares which is separated by the space. We use and equals to braces parameter to ensure that numbers are printed on the same line. We increment the counter by 1 to keep track of the number of perfect squares found. We increment num by 1 to move to the next number, and the loop continues until the count reaches gaps of n. That is, we have found n perfect squares. So after that loop, we use the print function without any arguments to add a new line which improves the output formatting. The next program is to prompt the user for two numbers a and b and display all the numbers between a and b. So here first solution is that we use the input function to prompt the user to enter two numbers a and b. Int function is used to convert the input values to integers. We determine the starting value start, ending value end for the loop by comparing a and b. We use this min and max functions to ensure that the start represents the smaller value and represents the larger value. And here we are using a for loop and the range function to iterate over the numbers between the start and end inclusive. And this range function basically generates a sequence of numbers from start to end. And for loop iterates over each number in that sequence. So inside that loop, we use a print function to display each number separated by the spaces. We use and equals to braces parameter to ensure that the numbers are printed on a same line. After that loop, we use the print function to show the new line. And this here we are not using any arguments, and it's just to improve the output formatting. The second solution is where we use its modified version. So we use if statement to determine the starting point and ending point of the loop. We compare a and b directly in the condition using this if statement. If a is less than or equals to b, we start a. We assign is a to start and b to end. If b is less than a, we assign b to start and a to end. And this ensures that start represents smaller value and end represents the larger value. And the rest of the program is same. That is, we are using for loop and the range function to iterate over the numbers between start and end and print each number in the console. The next program is to read numbers from the user until a negative number is entered and prints the sum of the positive numbers. So here we start by initializing the sum positives to 0. And this variable will hold the sum of all positive numbers which is entered by the user. We then enter a while loop that runs indefinitely while true, and inside this loop we prompt the user to enter a number using input and convert it to an integer using int. We check if that number is positive by comparing it to 0 using num greater than equals to 0. So if the number is positive, we add it to the sum positive variable. If the number is negative, we break out of the loop using the break statement. So once the loop is excited, we print the sum of positive numbers using print sum of positive numbers equals to sum positive. And the program will keep asking the user for numbers until a negative number is entered. Right? Next approach is using without using a break statement. So here we shall use the while loop to continuously read numbers from the users using a negative value until a negative value is entered. So however, instead of using this break statement, we apply this condition while number is greater than equals to 0 as the loop termination condition. So inside this loop, we first prompt the user to enter a number, convert it to the integer, then check if the number is positive. If it is, we add it to the sum positive variable. Otherwise, the loop continues until a negative number is entered. So once the loop is excited, we print the sum of positive numbers using this print statement. Sum of positive, sum positive, and by using the condition of the while loop as the exit condition, we avoid the need for break statement. The next program is to prompt the user for a number and display the Fibonacci sequence up to the given number using a repeating loop. So here it prompts the user to enter the number using this input and convert it into the integer using int. This program initializes two variables, previous number with the initial Fibonacci number 0, current number with the initial Fibonacci number 1. This program uses a while loop to generate and print the Fibonacci sequence up to the given numbers. And inside this loop, the program prints the current number, which is the next Fibonacci number, using this print statement. And this program calculates the next Fibonacci number by adding the previous number and current number and assign it to the next number variable. Then the program updates the previous number with the value current number, and this current number with the value next number, and the loop continues until this current number exceeds the given number. And by using only two variables and updating them in each iteration, the program generates and prints the Fibonacci sequence up to that given number without using a list. The next program is to read the numbers until the 0 is entered and display the average of all numbers. So here we'll initialize two variables, total and count, to keep track of sum of the numbers entered and the number of numbers entered respectively. The program enters a while loop with the condition true, which means the loop will continue indefinitely until a break statement is encountered. So inside this loop, the program prompts a user to enter a number using input, convert it into the integer using int, assign it to the number variable. So if that entered number is not 0, the program adds the number to the total variable and increments the count to 1. After this loop terminates, the program checks if any number were entered by comparing this count variable to 0. If there were numbers entered, it calculates the average by dividing the total by the count and assign it to the average variable. By repeatedly reading numbers from the user, summing them up and counting the number of inputs, this program calculates and displays the average of numbers entered. So when the user enters 0, the loop is terminated and the average is calculated and printed if there were any numbers entered. Otherwise, if no numbers were entered, a corresponding message is displayed. The next program is to prompt the user for a list of numbers until the user types the number 0 and displays the largest and smallest numbers. So here initialize two variables, largest and the smallest, to keep track of the largest and smallest numbers. The initial values are set to negative infinity and positive infinity to ensure that any number entered by the user will be larger than the initial largest value and the smaller than the initial smallest value. And this program enters a while loop with a condition true, which means the loop will continue indefinitely until that break statement is encountered. And inside this loop, the programmer prompts the user to enter a number using input, convert it to a float using float, and assign it to the number variable. And this programmer checks if that entered number is 0 using a if statement. If it is 0, the break statement is executed, which terminates the loop, continues to the next part of program. If entered number is not 0, program compares it with the current largest number and the smallest number using if statements. So if the number is larger than the current largest, it updates the value of largest to the entered number. Right? So if the number is smaller than the current smallest, it updates the value of smallest to the entered number. And after this loop terminates, the program checks if any numbers were entered by comparing the values of this largest and the smallest number. And finally, if no numbers were entered and the values of this largest and smallest were not updated, the program prints a corresponding message. The next program is to prompt the user for a sentence and display the number of vowels. So here it will prompt the user to enter a sentence using input function, assign it to sentence variable, and the program initializes the vowel count to 0 using this variable vowel count. And this program iterates over every character in the sentence using a for loop. Inside this for loop, the program converts each character to lowercase using this lower method to ensure case insensitive matching. And the program checks if the lowercase is a vowel by comparing it with AEIOU string, which contains all lowercase vowels. If the character is a vowel, program increments the vowel count by 1. After iterating over the characters in the sentence, the program displays the number of vowels using a print statement. The next program is to prompt the user for a number and display its divisors. So here first prompt the user to enter a number using this input function, convert it into integer, and then assign this number to the number variable. Use a for loop to iterate 1 to the given number, and inside this for loop check if the number is divisible. Right? If number is divisible by I, it means I is the divisor of that number. So it is directly printed using a print statement. And after iterating Over all possible divisors, the program displays the divisors on separate line. The next program is to determine the lowest common multiple between two numbers entered by user. So for this, first prompt the user to enter two numbers using input functions, convert them to integers using int function. The numbers are then assigned to the variables num1, num2. This program will iterate the maximum of two number using this maximum function, assign it to the variable maximum, which ensures that we start searching for the LCM from the larger number. The program uses a while loop to find the LCM. Inside this loop, if it checks if that maximum is divisible by both num1 and num2 without any remainder. If it is, it means the maximum is the LCM, so it is assigned to the variable LCM. Right? And the loop is terminated using a break statement. If the maximum is not LCM, the program increments maximum by 1 until the LCM is found. And once the LCM is determined, the program displays it using the print function. The next program is to determine the greatest common divisor between two numbers entered by users. So here the program will prompt the user to enter two numbers using input function, convert them to integers, and then numbers are assigned to the variables num1 and num2. The program determines the smaller of two numbers using this min function here. Right, assign it to the variable smaller, which ensures that we only iterate up to the smaller number when finding this GCD. And the program initializes the GCD variable to 1. The program uses a for loop to find the GCD. It iterates from 1 to smaller number using this range function. And for each iteration, it checks if both num1 and num2 are divisible by I without any remainder. If they are, it means that I is a common divisor, so it updates the GCD variable to I. And after this loop terminates, the GCD variable will hold the GCD of num1 and num2. And the program displays the GCD using this print function. The next program is to calculate the series below up to the 10th element. So here the program will prompt the user to enter the value of x using this input function, convert it to float using float function, and then assign that value to the variable x. This program will initialize the sum variable to 1 and the term variable to 1. The sum means total sum of the series, and the term variable means current term in the series. And this program will use a for loop to calculate the series up to 10th element. This loop iterates from 1 to 10 through this range function here. So for each iteration, it updates the term by multiplying it with x divided by n, where n is the current iteration. It then adds the term to the sum. After the loop completes, the sum variable will hold the approximation of e to the power x. The program uses math.exponential function to calculate the actual value of e to the power x and assign it to the variable result. The program displays this approximation of ex calculated using a series and actual value of e to the power x using this print function. The next program is to rewrite the same thing, like this calculates the value of sine using Taylor series until the difference between the terms is less than equals to less than this value, right? So here we will first import this math function. While we are importing math function, because we are using the sine function here, so first prompt the user to enter this angle in radians. We will provide the term, sum and n values here. We will calculate the sine function using this math library here, and here we will display the results like this. That's all for today. Thank you.